Hello and welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Alison Krauss and Union Station with New Favorite. And this is the first episode of 2015, and at the end of last year I was hoping to do a bit of a recap of all the most important science and nature stories of 2014, but unfortunately I kind of ran out of time because I did the reading list at the end of the year, and then suddenly it was Christmas Eve, and of course there wasn't a live show that night because you guys were probably off celebrating and I was in the US. So this is really the first opportunity I've had to wish you happy holidays, wish you a happy new year, and then also look back at the year that just passed and think about what happened. And when I was beginning to investigate this, to round up some of the most important stories, I came across an article on an online magazine that I just couldn't help but follow up. And it was an article that listed what their journalists thought were the creepiest science and nature stories of the year. And although creepiest may not be quite as important or groundbreaking as, the kind of just the most hard-hitting science stories in general, I thought that they certainly would maybe be a bit more fun to go through and to talk about on air. So on today's show, I want to think about the creepiest science and nature stories of the year. And unfortunately, the magazine article that I found was basically it was just a slideshow that had a bunch of pictures. So I had to track down each of these particular things and look into the science behind them, look into the results that were found, and try to figure out whether it was actually all that creepy and whether it was actually all that interesting. So I've weeded out of the 20 or so examples that they listed, maybe about half of them that I thought are hopefully going to be of interest to you guys. Now, the first one on my list is the finding that every one of us has mites living on our faces. And I'm not sure that this is exactly the newest of news, because we all have known for a while, I think, that we have mites and other little critters that live in our eyelashes and our eyebrows. But the new spin on this that happened in 2014 is that we found mites that are living in our pores, and this is a bit different. These are different species than had previously been sampled, and also the new finding is in how many people that these are present and what sorts of things that they do. So they've kind of expanded our knowledge of the microorganisms that live on the human skin and inhabit our human ecosystem, if you like. Now, these mites were found in 100% of samples that were taken from people 18 years old and up. And there were two different but equally harmless, I should stress, nothing to panic about, species that were found in these samples. The first was Demodex brevis, and the second was Demodex folliculorum. Now, the first of these, brevis, as you might expect from its name, is shorter and it's also rounder, and it spends most of its life deep inside the oil glands of a hair follicle. And the second lives closer to the surface and will venture out to look for better habitat, so a different follicle or pore to live in, and also, of course, for potential mates. And there tends to be only a single brevis per gland because it's really kind of embedded. It's down, deep inside the follicle. There's not much else, not much room for anyone else to live down there with it. But there tend to be 3 to 6 folliculorum per follicle. And given that we have about 5 million hair follicles per person, that suggests that we've got 5 million follicles times 15 to 30 million mites, or anywhere from 20 to 35 million per person. So this is quite a large mite ecosystem and mite habitat that we can provide. Now, we've known about mites like this for over 100 years. They were first described in 1842, of course, when technology wasn't what it is today, so we couldn't visualize them in quite the same way or run genetic samples the way that we can now. However, partly because of this, we weren't able to learn about the natural history of these organisms until just this year. But what's interesting is that even though we have made these kind of strides, these advances in mite biology, we still don't know how it is that humans get the mites. We don't know how humans originally got these mites. So when I say how we get them, I mean when you are young, how is it that you get mites suddenly appearing on you? But also I mean this over the longer term in terms of how do humans in general suddenly come to provide a space for these mites to live in. What happened in our evolutionary history that made these things attach themselves to us? We also don't really know what their role is in the ecosystem of our skin. Do they do things that keep us healthy? Does their activity influence us in some way? Could they completely vanish tomorrow without any noticeable effect? Who knows? We need to investigate this a bit further. Now, all of this research was performed by the Dunn Lab at North Carolina State University in the U.S., and this laboratory specializes in the ecosystems of our bodies. And you may have heard of them in the past because they recently did something called the Belly Button Project, which was designed, as you might guess, to look at the biodiversity in our belly buttons. And they go out and they get lots of volunteers to give swabs so they can collect samples of what's going on in and on our bodies. And because this is kind of a quirky and fun and unusual thing, a lot of people do volunteer to do this, so they can set up shop at schools or at a mall or some organization, and people are happy to swing by and give the sample that's needed. And in this case, mites can be collected in lots of different ways. So you can use Scotch tape, or sellotape as you guys would call it. You can pluck, you can scrape, you can squeeze pores, and they use kind of all of the above in order to harvest mites for this study. And they've been sampled from both live bodies and also dead bodies. And one of the interesting things they found here was that even after we die, our bodies can continue to host these mites, and 100% of the cadavers that they sampled did in fact have these organisms on them. And as I said at the very beginning, they were predominantly interested in people who were 18 and above. And that's because they know that 70% of younger individuals have these, but 30% don't. So that suggests that there's some time at which suddenly they come into contact with people who do have mites, or with habitats where the mites are found on other organisms, and they contract the mites, for lack of a better word, at that point. And so they are kind of interested in figuring out when is it that this happens, at what age, and why, and what's the prompt for all of this to happen. Now, the study also investigated mite relatedness, and the two different species that they looked at are not closely related, even though they do live in very similar spaces. So brevis is actually more similar to the mites that are found on dogs than to the mites that they live with on us. And brevis mites were more diverse than folliculorum mites that were taken from hosts in China, North America, and South America. So they haven't sampled people around the world, but they have still gotten quite an international sample that is fairly globally representative. So this reflects the fact that folliculorum is more active and also has more chances to mix up its genes. Remember, this is the one that lives on within the follicle itself rather than within the gland within the follicle. So it's kind of further up towards the surface. There are more of them per follicle, and each night they go out and kind of wander around, look for mates, look for different parts of the face to live on, and then potentially relocate. So thanks to all of this, they are a bit more active, and they do spread their genes around a bit more. And the genetic variation in the mites seems to map to splits and divergences that happened in human populations about 40,000 years ago. So again, that does suggest that these guys have been on us for quite a long time. And this is why it's kind of interesting to think evolutionarily how it is that we got these things, why, and at what point in our history. Now, the Face Mite project should lead to more papers in the future. This was really just the beginning, kind of announcing what they found as they just initiated the study. The lab is hoping to conduct further work that will allow them to explore the genetic relationships between humans and our mites, and to get a better idea of how these things are distributed around the world and what sorts of variations there are and why, from one person to the next and from one population of people to the next. Now, if you are a bit squeamish and you found that story hard to listen to, then you're going to be glad to know that the next one has nothing to do with humans. And in fact, the next creepy story on the list is about Kashmir musk deer. And the major headline here is actually not creepy at all. And it's just the fact that Kashmir musk deer has been seen for the first time in a very long time. And that means that we know that they are not extinct, which we had previously thought. And these guys, as you might guess from the name, live in the mountains of Afghanistan. And the thing that makes them so unusual is that they have tusks. And you might have seen this when it came out a few months ago, because these guys do look quite unusual, and it's a bit weird to think that there are deer out there that have tusks and look kind of like little vampires. So the species was last spotted in the wild in 1948 by a Danish expedition that was visiting the Perrin Valley. Now the deer are about the same size as a roe deer, but they are grayish in the winter with a small narrow head and no antlers whatsoever, which is a bit unusual, I think, to most of us because we're used to thinking of deer with antlers because that's what they use to fight each other, what the males use to fight each other to kind of get rivals to go away and to therefore impress the ladies and get mating opportunities. So obviously these guys do something else, and in fact that's where the teeth come into play. Thanks to this most recent sighting, we now have a total of 5 that have happened all kind of in a short period of time because there was a group that went out to look for these things, and all of these were reported together earlier this year in the journal Oryx. So as I said, the male deer don't use antlers to compete with each other and impress the females, and instead they grow these tusk-like teeth which look like vampire fangs, and they use them to fight their rival males. So they kind of get up close to each other and then kind of tilt their heads and bash each other with their fangs. So along with 6 other species of musk deer in Asia, this one is prized not only for its meat but also for its musk pouches, and that's where they get the name. And the musk, obviously, you're familiar with this word, it has a very strong scent, and it's used by the animals to kind of mark their area and to communicate with each other, but humans tend to like this because it can be used in medicine, and this is traditional medicine that probably doesn't really have a whole lot of basis in science, to be honest, but it also is quite useful in perfumes, and in fact a very large portion of perfumes do use some amount of musk extract, quite hard to say, so this is something that is highly valuable, and that's why, it's one of the reasons why anyway, that these deer don't have really huge populations these days. So the deer are listed as endangered because there were only these 5 sightings in a short period of time, and we don't really know how many of them there are, but we certainly know that they don't inhabit a really large area. So we know that if one little patch is wiped out, that could take all the deer with it, which is immediately something that puts them at risk. And they are probably threatened not just by deforestation, but also by hunting. And in fact, locals that were in the area where these things were sighted have reported that they have hunted the animals for years, and they've hunted them in the intervening years between the last sighting and this current sighting. It's just that no scientists had been around to see the deer and document them and therefore change the status of the species. And partly the reason that we haven't had any researchers out there is because the animals live in a really dangerous habitat. In addition to being a politically unstable area, there are also really steep slopes, it's quite high above sea level, and so it's just physically quite hard terrain for these people to get out to and then to wander up and down in search of these elusive animals. And what's kind of nice here is that it was the locals themselves who were involved in helping the scientists find these things, so it's kind of a collaborative effort. So these villagers that had been out and seen these things, had hunted them, were telling the scientists where they'd seen them. They were telling them how they could access the remote sites, and they were kind of guiding them around the region. And so the researchers were able to pick out some routes that they could use to get there on foot, and when they were out they found first a lone male, and then a female with a fawn, which is actually quite an encouraging sign, and then another lone female, and this actually could be the same one just without her fawn this time, and they aren't quite sure. So they could have seen as many as 5 animals, or it may just have been the female, the male, and the fawn, which would be just 3. So the animals were aware that they were being watched at the time, and unfortunately this meant that the researchers were only able to make a count of the animals. They weren't really able to watch them and see what their behavior was like, because when the deer are on alert, they just kind of stand and look and keep their ears pricked up and make sure that there aren't any predators coming. So they weren't really doing too much except being watchful. But hopefully in the future, now that we know where these things can be found, people can go out and do longer-term studies and collect more information about them. And if we can get the villagers involved and maybe do what has happened in other kind of conservationally sensitive areas, we might be able to pay the villagers to participate in the research, and in that way kind of convince them that it would be better not to hunt the animals but instead to study them. So then there would be animals that would actually be there to study, and also the ones that are around wouldn't be as skittish and maybe would let people sit and watch them for a bit longer. So that is quite encouraging news, as well as being potentially slightly creepy if you don't like the idea of your deer having long, sharp fangs. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was She and Him with Brand New Shoes. And in case you're just joining us, I will tell you that on today's show, I am looking back at some of the news stories that happened in 2014. And although I was initially interested in thinking about just the most important and groundbreaking studies that happened throughout the year, when I was researching the topic, I stumbled across a list of the creepiest news stories, and I thought that might be a bit more fun. So I'm counting down some of the most creepy findings that happened over the year. And the first of these was some new information that we have about the mites that live on our faces. And the second was the finding that the Kashmir musk deer, which has fangs rather than antlers, is still alive and well in the mountains of Afghanistan, even though for years we thought it was extinct. So the next thing on my list is definitely more on the creepy, the high end of the creepy scale than the last one, and this is the finding that on every continent except for Antarctica, spiders catch and eat fish. And this was something that was determined by Swiss zoologist Martin Nieffler, which I may be mispronouncing. All apologies, Martin, if you're listening. And this guy began to review the spider ecology literature because he was interested in getting a better understanding of spider diets around the world. So basically, he was just downloading all of the articles that he could find about what spiders on all the different continents and all the different habitats were using as their food, because he wanted to try to make some broad generalizations about the life histories of this particular type of organism. Now, of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of species of spiders, so that's quite a lot of reading that he was doing, and you would expect that some of these animals would have certain unusual behaviors that others don't have, so maybe it's not entirely of surprise that there are a few spiders that capture fish, but I think the surprising thing was that actually they weren't as uncommon as you might have guessed, and that they are quite widespread. So he compiled data from a huge variety of scientific publications, including many that had previously been overlooked because they were really old, they were quite obscure, or maybe they were written in a foreign language that previous authors who were interested in these same questions just weren't able to understand. So he followed up by contacting biologists and photographers and getting confirmation and images about all these different things that he was extracting from this massive wealth of papers, I should say, not just one paper. Now, in a previous report, and you may have seen this in the news because it did get quite a lot of attention, he reported that spiders eat bats and earthworms and snails and lots of other unusual prey items that we didn't really realize they utilized all that much, or at least utilized as much as they do. And this year he added fish to the list after confirming 89 known incidents of fish hunting spiders, and these were spread across 8 different families, but were particularly common in the genus Dolomedes, which are also known as raft spiders. Now, spider hunting, he found, was particularly common in certain areas, and this is between 40 degrees north and 40 degrees south of the equator. And if you know your geography, you'll be aware that this is an area where the water is warmer and it's also less oxygenated. And that means that the fish are not able to get lots of food in the middle kind of portion of the water column or down at the bottom of the bed. Instead, they have to go up to the top and take advantage of whatever is falling in from the surface. There's just not a lot of nutrients down deeper in the water, so they have to wait and kind of opportunistically take advantage of things that fall in or kind of temporarily land there. So you've got a lot of flies and larvae and things like that the fish would be coming up to the surface to grab from under the water. And what they find is that the spiders are waiting there to grab the fish just after the fish get their own prey. And in fact, the spiders will sit and wait with their back legs on a rock or some other kind of stable surface that's there next to the edge of the water, and then they put their front legs touching the water so they can feel when the fish are coming near to the surface. So they have very sensitive feet and legs that are able to tell them that there is some movement under the water. They can feel as the little waves start forming, and that allows them to get ready to pounce. And as soon as the fish break the surface, the spiders are able to reach out and grab them, and then they deliver neurotoxins via an initial bite. And the neurotoxins make it difficult for the fish to react. So it might completely paralyze them or just kind of stun them or whatever is exactly happening. It allows the spiders to take control and drag the fish out of the water. They then take them to a safe eating place and fill them with digestive enzymes that mean that the fish then basically begin to disintegrate from the inside out. And once the fish are nice and mushy, the spiders can eat everything but the bones, which don't always fall apart quite as much as the flesh and the other internal organs. And if that doesn't make you hungry for lunch, then I don't know what will. So this appears to actually be a relatively common behavior, but it's not easy to see in the wild. And in fact, one of the photographers that the scientists contacted in order to get confirmation of this, because one of the things he did, in addition to looking at scientific papers, was he scanned the internet for photographs and for accounts of these sorts of things. And so he was looking through Flickr and Tumblr and things like that. And so he found that there were some amateur photographers who had gone out, not scientists at all, but just people who had gone out and taken photographs, and he contacted them and asked them about what they'd seen. So one of these guys reported that he had spent 300 hours in the field taking wetland photos in, I think it was the Everglades, and during all that time he only saw spiders fishing about half a dozen times. So this is a really rare thing, which is probably why, in addition to the fact that the literature is far-flung, some of it's quite old, it's not always in English, that's why we haven't really known about this until just this year. So hopefully none of you are arachnophobes, and if you weren't before, you certainly might be now, because that's kind of a horrifying thought and not the most pleasant of ideas, but really interesting behavior among spiders. So now that I'm on the topic of food, I guess I might as well stick with that and think a little bit about our own eating behaviors. And this is kind of an interesting finding, that gut microbes may control our cravings by sending chemical cues to our brains. And this is actually not a firm finding, so we don't know this to be true, but this was a really interesting suggestion, something that was hypothesized this year by a researcher who was looking into some of the patterns and trends he was seeing in human digestion and in the ways that microbes interact with humans. And so this is a proposal that he has and something that he thinks that scientists should be looking into in the near future. And if you've listened to the show in the past, you'll know that the microbiome is kind of a hot topic. People are really interested in understanding what are the little tiny organisms that live in and on us and how do they affect us. And this is particularly interesting in the case of our intestinal tract, because they really can impact how we digest things, whether we're digesting very well, what sorts of things we can digest. We're all out there buying probiotics all the time because the commercials are telling us it's really good for us and we need it in order to function. And so it's really interesting to look at this scientifically and ask whether that's actually the case. Is this stuff good for us? If it is good for us, what exactly is it doing? And so this is the kind of work that this guy and his lab are doing. Now, what he was saying is that microbes have the means, the motives, and the opportunity to manipulate us. And by manipulate, what he means is altering our behavior in order to advance their own evolutionary success. And this is something that we see in lots of parasites, whether we're talking about organisms that are actually working with us mutually and mutualistically, or whether they're things that are actually the scientific definition of parasite, which is kind of taking advantage of us and not really giving anything back. So, and in fact, doing harm. And in the past I've talked about this when I've talked about, for example, the ants and the caterpillars that might have the fungi infections and the other sorts of infections that will drive them to go to a new place. They'll completely relocate, and then these things will send out spores and kill them in the process, and it's obviously not any good for the ants or the caterpillars to be carrying around these things and then have them eat them from the inside out. And it's completely the microorganisms that are driving those behaviors in their hosts. And so obviously that's an example of something that's using the host for their own means and not advancing the happiness or health of the host at all. And it's not quite this extreme, what these researchers are proposing for gut microbes, but it's something, potentially along those lines. And in this case, the microbes might be able to do this by releasing chemicals, including things like dopamine and serotonin, which are what our neurons use to communicate with each other, and then delivering those to nerve endings that line our gastrointestinal tract. So even though they are living in our stomachs and our intestines, they might be able to deliver those chemicals there, have the chemicals taken up to our brains, and then impact our behaviors and our attitudes remotely. Now, we already know that bacterial chemicals can alter our brain biochemistry, and this has implications for our mental state. People who have no gut microbes tend to be more anxious and have a worse memory. This has been shown in previous studies. We also know in mice that the addition of gut bacteria has altered stress levels experimentally. This is a very convincing result because it wasn't just an observation, it was actually done experimentally with a control and different groups that they could compare with each other. And we also know that mice with different types of gut microbes tend to have different types of food preferences. So bacteria-free mice, for example, develop more sweet receptors and prefer sweeter drinks than the mice that have more bacteria. Finally, previous studies have also shown that the presence of bacteria can alter hormones that are associated with appetite. So whether or not we have the bacteria might impact whether we want to eat at all, as well as what it is we want to eat. So all in all, this suggests that gut bacteria could play a role in the development of our cravings. And this might happen because different microbes thrive on different types of foods, and so each different species wants to be able to make the host eat whatever food is best for that species. And this might help explain certain cravings that go beyond the need to build up lacking nutrients. And it might also explain certain addictions where we want to, we want more and more of something and we want it all the time. And what's really interesting is that this goes beyond just being hungry, but, truly like an addiction. So if you've got an addiction to a drug, it's not just that you want to smoke another cigarette, for example. It's suddenly you find that after a while you need more cigarettes to no longer have that craving. So it's not just wanting to do it, but how much you need whenever that desire comes up. And this all could be seen in the context of gut microbes and human cravings. And if the relationship is true, it might not just be the case that the microbes are manipulating us, like those fungi and the ants and the caterpillars. It might also be the case that it's mutually beneficial. So for example, in previous studies, researchers have found that mice without any germs avoid contact with other mice. But being social is good for bacteria that want to spread, but it's also good for maintaining social bonds that facilitate survival. So if bacteria cause us, or cause the mice, I don't want to draw too many conclusions, if the bacteria cause the mice to spend more time in proximity to other mice because the bacteria need to be able to spread from one host to another, that also has the side effect of being good for the mice that then have that social contact and maintain pair bonds in order to take care of young, or maintain a group bond so that they look out for predators together, or whatever else might be going on that is kind of good when you've got a community rather than just a few separate individuals working alone. So you could extrapolate to humans, for example, and see how a similar sort of thing might happen there. Now, the next important step in this system is to conduct experiments to see whether the bacteria are actually manipulating us. So we would need to see, are the bacteria actually putting out these sorts of chemicals? Are there variations in the amounts of chemicals? Are different bacteria doing different things at different times? And if you add or subtract certain bacteria from our gut systems, does that have an impact on what we're craving? So it's actually quite a lot of variables that you'd have to get a handle on little by little in order to build up a real case that this is going on. And we can also investigate whether we can intentionally manipulate our gut bacteria in a helpful way. So for example, could we ingest more bacteria that prefer healthier foods in order to trump our cravings for things like ice cream and chocolate and soda, and instead facilitate cravings for salad and nice whole wheat bread and other stuff that is better for our bodies? So this might actually have implications that are quite useful in medicine for keeping us healthier, maybe treating certain addictions, maybe overcoming certain deficiencies. Maybe this particularly would be important in people who are already unhealthy, or maybe in pregnant women, or whatever the case might be. So this could have lots of applications if it proves to be the case. And of course that will be the next big step. So one more piece of news before I break for a song, and that is number 5 on my list of strange findings from over the past year. The finding of a new marsupial species in Australia. And this marsupial species is named the black-tailed antechinus. And that doesn't really sound all that creepy or unusual until you find out the final bit of the story, which is that this particular animal mates until it dies. So basically it has sex to death. And the antechinus is a rodent-like animal that has a long black tail, a pink nose, 5-toed feet, and black fur with orange and kind of yellowy orange around its eyes. It basically looks like a little rat, to be honest, but it has kind of a long nose. And it is pretty closely related to some other antechinus species as well, but those particular coloration patterns are what told the researchers that this was not the same old species that they were used to. And they caught specimens in Springbrook National Park in southeastern Australia with traps that had been baited with peanut butter and oats. And they actually weren't going out to get these guys, it's just that they had the traps there, and when they saw these individuals they realized that they were a bit different from the other antechinus species that they'd seen before, and that's when they got excited and thought maybe this was a new species of mammal that they had found. And in fact, the same research team had recently found 2 other species of antechinus in the same area, which is why they were continuing to trap in this region, kind of around Queensland. And what's really amazing about this is that only a few new mammal species are found each year, period. So here these guys have found not just the one from last year, but also the 2 others in very recent history. Actually, it may have happened last year as well. So that's quite a lot of discovery in this one little place by this one research team, which really shows you how much there is out there that we still haven't seen and documented, even in the areas that we've lived in for hundreds of years. Now, on to the interesting part of this finding. We know that animals in the antechinus genus are promiscuous, so the females give birth to large broods, and the broods contain young from several fathers. And in some cases, each different young animal comes from a different father. So the females really are mixing up the genes and mating with lots of individuals. So in order to increase the likelihood that each male is going to produce offspring, he will mate with female for hours at a time, and he'll do this with one female after another, because basically the longer he mates with a female, the more he can inject her with his own sperm and his own genes, but also the more he can keep her away from other potential mates that want to mate with her next. And in a lot of animals it turns out to be the case that whoever has mated with the female most frequently is the one who ends up getting the most offspring. So this guy, each of these antechinus individuals would want to mate with a female for as long as possible and be the last ones that she mates with. And when they do mate with them, give them as much sperm as possible. And all of this, as you might imagine, is extremely stressful for the males. Their stress levels spike, and this is really hard on their bodies, on their immune systems, on basically all the functions that their poor little systems are trying to do at the same time, and eventually they become completely exhausted from the process, and they just drop over dead. And pretty much all of them are dead before their young are even born. And the females continue to collect sperm throughout the breeding season, so they go quite a long time where they have an opportunity to meet male after male and go through this promiscuous process of gathering sperm. And that's why they're able to produce so many different half-siblings, because they don't ovulate until the very end of the breeding season. And some females are able to breed multiple times, which is just a phenomenal amount of energy if you think about it, what they're putting into creating all of the young in one breeding attempt. To then be able to do it 2 or 3 times, they just must be incredibly fit individuals, full of energy, with really strong systems. But actually this is not very common. Most of them also die within one breeding season, but unlike the males, they do have a chance to see their young born, and the young, of course, are dependent on the females. So it's not until after weaning that most of the females would then die. So the researchers are now trying to get endangered species protection for this marsupial because it doesn't appear to be very widespread. It may just be found in that one little area where they found it, and that probably has to do with the fact that there are lots of other species as well. So it sounds like this is a place where you've got a lot of closely related species that have found some little habitat niche, and so you've got just lots of little pockets of things that used to all be one species but then branched off as they kind of specialized in one particular way of feeding or a particular schedule or part of the habitat. So they are looking to protect these things in order to then keep them healthy, keep their population levels at large enough numbers that they would be able to go out and collect more information on them and study more about their very interesting way of life. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Nickel Creek with Brand New Sidewalk. And on today's show, just as a reminder, I am counting down some of the most interesting and creepy science stories of 2014. And the next item on my list is the finding that alligators and crocodiles can climb trees. And you might think that this is something that we should have known by now because we've been in alligator and crocodile infested areas for quite a long time. But of course, these tend to be quite remote areas. Maybe there have been these behaviors all along and we just didn't see them, or the news didn't travel very quickly, or maybe it just has something to do with the fact that herpetologists aren't sharing this information far and wide. But this year, finally, it hit the news in a big way, so now the rest of us know. And it's kind of a scary thing if you're in these areas, because now you don't just look for danger from below the water, you're also supposed to be looking up above you as you wander around. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing because neither of these animals, or types of animal I should say, there are lots of different species, neither of them have any special anatomic adaptations for gripping branches. And despite this, they have found a way to be able to climb trees and to do it quite frequently. And they may actually go as high as the crown and then crawl out on large limbs and sun themselves. And the behavior was first documented by a researcher from the University of Tennessee's Knoxville campus in the U.S., who was conducting basic natural history research on the animals. And during this time, while he was out in the field, he encountered lots of them up in the tree. So he did a little bit of rummaging around in the scientific literature when he returned home and found that climbing has been observed in North America, in Africa, and in Australia by 4 different species. So this was not just an isolated incident or two that he stumbled across in one particular region while he was out doing research. And in fact, this seems to be a relatively widespread phenomenon. So he then did a little bit more research and was trying to figure out a bit more about why this would happen and what exactly the animals were doing. So ultimately what he found was not so much about real life history research that scientists had done in the field, but instead anecdotal reports from people who were living near crocodilian habitats. And this was kind of buried in the literature, which is a recurring theme you'll notice from tonight's show. So obviously there are some really interesting things that are out there. It's just they're in obscure places, or they're quite old, or they're in the wrong language, and so the rest of us just haven't found out about them yet. It kind of makes you wonder what else is out there that we need to go unearth in a little bit of scientific sleuthing. In any case, what this guy found was that it isn't really well known by the field, and it isn't observed quite a lot, but researchers think it's not a new adaptation. They don't think it's something that the crocodiles and the alligators have started doing recently after they've been increasingly exposed to humans and human disturbance. They think that this is something that goes well back into the evolutionary history of these animals, and in fact there were some extinct ancestors that were fairly well adapted to climbing and did so regularly. And it may be the case that although these guys don't have quite the same shape, it may be that they have carried on this behavior over the years and we just really haven't observed it in an obvious way or in enough ways that it has kind of pervaded our consciousness as a society. So they do it, we just don't really think about the fact that they do it. Now, crocodiles probably climb trees for a couple of different reasons. The first is thermoregulation. As I said, they're probably up there in the crown sunning themselves. But the second is observation. So they've been found in trees most often in areas where they didn't have basking spots on the ground, which suggests that this lack of space is what drove them vertically to find a place in order to get into the sun. But also the researcher who did all of this kind of exploration of the scientific literature, he noted that when they were approached in this position, the animals were able to drop to the water very quickly and just disappear when he was still at quite a long distance from them. And this prompted him to think that perhaps they may also go up there sometimes because it allows them to see over much greater distances, and so they were able to see potential predators coming and vanish. Or maybe even they could see prey coming and get themselves in position in the water in order to their hunting tactic tends to be to take things by surprise, so they could get themselves ready to be able to do that when potential prey would come up. So this is all kind of interesting stuff, and maybe the researchers will go out and do a bit more work on this in order to find out a bit more about this behavior, potentially even do some experiments to really try to figure out why it is the crocodiles and the alligators are up there. Now, this is the same research team that recently made headlines on another little bit of crocodilian behavioral biology, and that's the finding that crocodiles use sticks to catch birds. So they're using sticks as tools, and tool use is not incredibly widespread amongst animals, and so this is quite an exciting thing because it suggests a bit more advanced thought than we're used to thinking that these animals are capable of. And in this case, what they found was that the crocodiles would lie with their noses under piles of twigs during the breeding season, and then as soon as birds would come close to grab the twigs as nesting material, the crocodiles would snap at them and catch them as prey, which is pretty fantastic, and you might have seen that in the news as well, because that did make serious headlines, because it's quite unusual to think that reptiles would actually be that clever and conniving. So that's kind of an interesting thing that, cumulatively, all these things I'm telling you tonight might make you not want to go outside ever again, because it's all a bit sketchy, all these things that are happening in the animal kingdom. We're being approached from outside and also from inside by our gut microbes. So I'll give you something else, the last one on my list, that hopefully is not quite as creepy in the same way, so you won't be as scared of nature. And this is the finding that people can easily be fooled by cyranoids. And cyranoids are people who speak words that originate in the minds of other people, who then transmit those words to the speaker using a radio transmitter. And all of that sounds a bit complicated, so let me explain. If you know the story of Cyrano de Bergerac, then you already might have kind of figured out where I'm going with this. So the phrase cyranoid is inspired by that play, and in the play there's an unattractive man who woos a woman by sending her love letters that are signed with the name of a handsome nobleman, someone else entirely. And you may not have seen the play, but you'll probably have seen the movie, so you'll be familiar with this plot. And in the current study, what the researchers did is kind of recreate this, but in a scientific way. So they had subjects that would enter a room in which a young boy was seated. And the subjects thought they were supposed to learn about the boy's intelligence and his personality, and so they were asking him questions about current events and other topics that would allow them to kind of gauge what he knew and how much he knew. Now, all of his responses were actually transmitted to him by a 37-year-old university professor, the author of the study, who was sitting in a nearby room. So that meant that the boys seemed to be surprisingly well informed and know much more than you might anticipate of a 12-year-old. But despite this discrepancy, the subjects didn't really seem surprised. It didn't seem unusual to them that he would be this well educated and have this kind of vocabulary. Instead, they just kind of assumed that he was well educated. Now, the psychologists who performed the study are interested in asking questions about our personality and what makes each one of us unique and obviously different from other people. So this is what drove them to create such an unusual situation. And we think that we can recognize some element that makes us who we are, something besides just our physical selves. And yet in this case, we see that the study subjects were easily fooled. So the next question was to ask whether this result would change if the cyranoid was someone who was known, but speaking the words of someone who wasn't known, and also if people could recognize friends and loved ones that were speaking to them via a cyranoid. And you can see where this might have applications, for example, in the world of AI and maybe programming computers to interact with us like real people and like people that we know and love. Now, this line of research was originally initiated in the past by Stanley Milgram, who performed a really famous study in which he investigated whether people would willingly cause harm to others if they were told to do so by people of authority. And you might have heard about this because it is discussed in a lot of psychology classes and behavior classes, cognition. Basically, he just had volunteers put on a lab coat and look important, and they would go in and tell people to deliver a shock to people in a room. And the shock wasn't actually real, but the people who were pressing the button thought that it was. And because they were being told to do this by someone seemingly of authority, they pretty much all agreed to do so. And it really shows you how we can be twisted by other people and how we can have certain perceptions of who's in power and who's not, and then just do whatever we think is expected of us. Now, he seems to have been drawn into that area of study because he was following obedience experiments in which study subjects were divorcing their own personalities from their bodies and letting an authority figure act through them. And Milgram didn't actually publish any studies, but he kind of started this field by going down this particular avenue of research. And his findings had some interesting implications that the current authors wanted to follow up on. Also, we have seen in recent years artists looking into this as well as a way to kind of do performance art that looks into these same sorts of philosophical issues. So, for example, performance artists will go into a room and act as a cyranoid where visitors could both talk to them and experience the situation of interacting with the cyranoid, but also go into the next room, put on the headset, and be the person giving the words and the thoughts to the cyranoid. So they could kind of be on both sides of that activity. And there was one artist who did this and reported that even friends that came and talked to him didn't realize that he was being controlled by someone else, despite the fact that some of his responses were really unusual, and he would say things indicating that he didn't know who these people were. So scientists think that cyranoids could be a really interesting way to study human social interactions. How do people function within organizations? How does our outward appearance affect interactions with other people? What are the impacts of age and gender on how we perceive people's contributions? And so on and so forth. So this could be quite an interesting thing to explore in more detail, not just to make companies function better, not just to help your chances of fitting in with a company and doing better in an office, although of course that might be kind of useful as well, but considering how we live in an era where we're all interacting online and we're interacting remotely, and basically we all could be cyranoids. So this is something that might be quite useful for figuring out how it is that we interact online and how to improve interactions and make them both pleasant and also as honest as possible. So unfortunately I'm out of time. I had some other interesting stories on my creepy news items list, but maybe I'll be able to add those into next week's show in case you're curious. But that is all for me for now. I hope that you have enjoyed this little summary of what happened in 2014, and now we can start compiling our list for 2015. Talk to you next week.